Welcome to Deep Engineering Live interview series, where we bring you insights from engineering leaders, architects, and practitioners who are shaping how modern systems are designed, built, and governed. I'm Sakib Jan, Editor-in-Chief of Deep Engineering, a publication and a weekly newsletter. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Erik Wilde. Erik is Head of Enterprise Strategy at Jentic, where he focuses on workflow automation and API ecosystem tooling. He's also a long-standing contributor to web standards and API design, with deep experience across OpenAPI, REST, and the evolving landscape of agentic-facing APIs and MCP governance. Let me bring Erik on stage so that we can have a conversation going. Hi, Erik. Welcome again.
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, I can hear you. Erik, just quickly want to start, if you could please speak a bit about your background in API community. So I want to give you the floor.
Okay, yeah, so thanks. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's going to be fun. I like these formats. It's always interesting to just chat about where things are going. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. So my name is Erik Wilde. I am from Germany originally, live in Switzerland now, in Zurich, where it's nice and sunny today. And I've been working on APIs, so to speak, all of my life in some shape or form. I started with communication systems and protocols and these kind of things, and then moved into the API space proper, let's say about 12 years ago or something. And I've mostly worked for companies who sell kind of enterprise software in that space. So typically API gateways, API platforms, all these kind of things where as a large company, typically you do have a lot of digital capabilities, whatever you call these things. And a lot of those have APIs. And more, of course, companies have realized that the better you maintain, manage, extend, and govern that real estate, the easier it becomes for you to develop new apps, to realize maybe potential that's within your company, but needs a little bit of digging to get to, so to speak. That was always interesting, and I've been doing that for quite a while. And then now it's almost a year ago, not quite yet, but about a year ago, I met the two founders of Jentic, Sean Blanchfield and Michael Courtnett. And we had a long conversation, and they were describing to me what they were doing, and then maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But very briefly, right? So what they want to do is they want to build a platform where agents can use APIs, right? So there are APIs, which of course are very important for agents to get data and take action. But oftentimes these APIs might not be the ideal ones for those agents. And you also might want to control these agents a little bit more because you might not be confident that they always do the right thing, right? We all know that AI has this tendency to sometimes have surprising ideas. So I really like that idea. I decided that I've never done that before, so I decided I would join that startup. So I joined last fall. So I've been working at Jentic now for a little over a half year, I would say. And it's really cool, I have to say. The startup experience is cool. I also like that I now get to dip my toes a little bit more into the AI space, which is really exciting. Also very exhausting, but also exciting. So yeah, I'm still talking about APIs because I think in the end, it's what AI needs. Without APIs, in my mind, there just is no AI.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erik. I can see that people have already started asking questions. Even we have not begun our session.
Very good. Keep them coming. Keep them coming.
So a quick note about that. Please use the chat session to interact with us. We will also share some links. The question is posted right now in the chat section. So I would encourage you guys to use question and answer section, which is below the chat one. And you can post your questions directly over there because I can show the questions on stage. And even if you would like to come on stage and speak with Erik, we would be happy to do that as well. So yeah. All right. So Erik, let's just begin our conversation again. It's great to have you with us today. Really appreciate that. Now, yeah, thanks for posting that link. Now, let's talk a little bit about OpenAPI 3.0. Right. It shipped last year, September 2025. So what changes have the highest operational impact for engineering teams, and which are mostly nice to,
Yes, I mean 3.0 2 is kind of a maintenance release, right? So it's backwards compatible. It doesn't really change things dramatically. What it is not, to start that way, is it's not really AI focused. So that's what we plan for being kind of the next version coming along, 3.3. There we really want to be a little bit more aggressive and thinking about what would it take to make OpenAPI specifically more AI friendly. But as we all know, a lot of AI friendliness oftentimes really is in human facing descriptions, because that's what AI is working with. And therefore, even in that space, right? So for example, now the tag system has been extended so that the tags where you can tag operations and you can kind of group things is now a hierarchical space, which actually means you can use it in a much more powerful way, right? So you can basically have tags and subtags and subtags and so forth. You don't have to do it, but you can do it. And that's something that people always wanted to do. And all of these questions of how to make anything, and OpenAPI in that space, and in that case specifically, semantically richer, right? To allow descriptions to carry more meaning is very valuable for AI. So that's something where I think thinking about how do you really describe your APIs, not just as technical endpoints, but as semantic services, right? As something where you want rich schemas. The schemas should have descriptions and these things. So there are a lot of guidelines. So we at Jentic, we have released a scoring mechanism for APIs so that you can find out whether your API is a little bit more AI friendly or not so much. And that is a lot about these kind of just using the mechanisms that are there. So for example, put in more descriptions, put in more examples, always have clear and well-defined error messages, all these kind of things, which to some extent you could say is just general good API design. But I think when we were still designing most of your developers are a little bit more forgiving. They maybe look at an OpenAPI description and say, okay, that's not perfect. And I don't really have that many examples, but I kind of know how this works, so I can figure it out. If an AI agent looks at a poorly described API and it cannot figure out how it works, it will just move on to the next one, right? It just can't figure it out. It has less context, it has less experience, so it doesn't really know as well as a human developer what to do. So I think what matters right now is check out what is new in 3.2, which is not a ton, right? It's a relatively small release, which I think is actually fine. But more importantly, I would almost say start thinking about how you can improve your API designs to be more agent friendly, because at some point in time, you will have agents that want to use your APIs, even if right now you don't, right? But the APIs that you design now will probably be around for a couple of years, right? So I think it's a good idea to really start thinking about this new class of consumers that in all likelihood will only get bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's a great need for developing APIs, not just for developers, but for AI as well. Erik, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Erik, I also want to talk about streaming is also, now explicitly supported in 3.2. So when teams document streaming, what details separate readable from implementable and testable?
Well, I think in the end, streaming always was something that people were doing. I think it just has become so much more visible because that's how all of the AI APIs work, right? If we use a chatbot, right, then kind of the stuff coming back, like you kind of see how the stuff gets sent, right? So that's kind of streaming in action. And I think that's just the thing that we've all been using that for quite a while. Right now, there is just a little bit more explicit way how you can actually document that in OpenAPI. And that's actually, I would say that is a very common pattern with a lot of OpenAPI improvement over the years, where it's not that something entirely new is added. It's more that people now can actually document something that they have been doing before, but that wasn't really covered well by OpenAPI. Now it actually is, right? So I mean, another example with that would be WebSockets. So WebSockets are actually something that is very popular. I was very surprised when somebody gave me a statistic and said of the 100 most popular APIs, around 60% of them, which to me was a really amazingly high number, about 60% of them use WebSockets, right? So because WebSockets often are like a very interesting and useful convenience function, right? Like you do something with the API, and at some point the API can actually call you back and say, hey, this is done, right? Like this is finished. This process is now finished. You can go and fetch the results or whatever it is that you're doing, but it's just a good convenience function. And that's something that people have been doing for a long time because it's good practice for quite a number of use cases in APIs, but it was never explicitly supported in OpenAPI, right? And that's another thing where at some point the OpenAPI specification just gets extended to also now be able to cover webhooks, which just makes it a little bit more complete, so to speak, in terms of covering all the stuff that you're doing.
3.2 tag structure adds nesting and kind. So how do you use tags as information architecture for large API catalogs, and how do you govern that taxonomy across teams?
That is a good and a very demanding question, right? Because that, I would say, goes way beyond OpenAPI and would generally say, how do you have like a data dictionary or this kind of general way of how things are getting named in an organization, right? And I think organizations always have a hard time doing that because it is hard to agree on terms, and it's hard to make sure that everybody understands which terms are there, understands what they mean, and also knows when to use those. And the tags are no different, right? They give you a way how you can assign a certain meaning to things in your OpenAPI description. What that meaning is entirely up to you, right? It used to be that tags would be relatively, let's say, minor things, right? Like the typical thing would be to say, okay, here are all the operations that are about customers, and here are all the operations that are about products, and here are all the operations that are about something else, right? And then the typical documentation tools would then kind of nicely group things by tag and would make them discoverable by tag. And that would give you a little bit of a structure for the API, mostly documentation, right? So with a structured tags, now you could go much further, right? You could have like a hierarchy of unlimited depth if you want to, right? So for each thing that you are using in your API, you could now use a term that maybe is linked to some kind of data dictionary or to some kind of ontology or whatever it is that you have. I haven't seen that so far, people doing that, but I'm pretty sure that actually people will start doing that. So if anybody has seen people doing that, please let us know in the chat. I'm really curious to see that. But like I said, I would say I wouldn't necessarily go crazy with just using OpenAPI tags in a very, very complex way, because in the end, the terminology, if you start introducing complex terminology with different hierarchies and grouping and then all these kind of things, you probably also need to align that with other places in your organization where things are getting tagged, right? It may be in databases, it's maybe in document stores, it may be wherever you manage information, right? You may have tags. So I think my recommendation would be check out what your general information architecture look like in your organization. What are the things that people are doing? What are the places where there already are dictionaries or terminologies that are established? And then think about how you map that basically into the OpenAPI tag model. So that you don't start inventing like it's whole complex little standalone thing, because that I think then becomes probably problematic over time. Okay. Are you reading the questions? Should I be reading the questions?
I am reading the questions, but I think
Okay.
We're not taking the questions as of now. This one
Okay,
is
good.
about Miguel, and it's about MCP. I think that is something we are covering in another 10-15 minutes. So Miguel, I would request you to post that question in the Q&A, and yeah, we'll take it up very soon. But yes, thank you so much, Eric. That was really helpful. Speaking about 3.2. Now, I think we want to dig deeper and talk about linting. Linting, particularly as a quality gate. Talk about maybe rules, ownership, and scale. I think scale easy. There's a I think Tristan, he is a senior software engineer at Speakeasy. He frames this question, linting as quality gates plus rapid feedback. So how do you design a rule set taxonomy that maps cleanly to real ownership, like for platform versus product teams?
So what you see that linting is used for right now is basically governance and some level of automation, right? So that in the end, what you want people to be able to do is if they start, let's say, designing APIs or changing APIs, that they get quick feedback on whether they are following certain guidelines or not. And what you've seen happening is that quite a number of these guidelines get published. So some organizations are just publishing their rule sets, right? They're on GitHub or some other places. I have a collection of them, about, I think, like 30 or 40 ones that I could find, like publicly accessible ones. But yeah, it's just interesting to look at those. And what some people do is they just reuse those. So you may have heard the Zalando ones are pretty popular. That's a German company because they have been around for quite a while. Adidas also has some pretty good ones. But yeah, there are some by a lot of companies. There are some by government, by e-government initiatives who publish their guidelines. Linting is useful, but it also has some limitations, let's say. So often, like the popular tools, when you look at Spectral or Vacuum or Redocly is another popular tool, right? Like they all kind of work in a similar way. So you have rules that apply to certain parts of your OpenAPI description, and then they check for certain conditions to be met, right? It may be something like, well, if I have an operation, it needs to have a description, and the description needs to be at least, 20 characters long or something like this, right? But it's a relatively, let's say, structural check. That's what I would call it, right? It really looks at, is the structure of the OpenAPI the way that we want it to be? Are all the fields there that we want to be there? And that's useful. I would still very much recommend to do that. I'm not a big fan of just reusing existing rule sets. I would always say start owning this, start building up your own, start that in a collaborative fashion so that somewhere you have like a GitHub repo or some place where developers can add and discuss new rules, right? And say, I think it would be good if we started following this guideline. And then people can pitch in. And at some point, people either say, okay, that seems to be a useful thing to follow from now on. And then it gets merged into your rules. You might also have different rules for different steps of the API lifecycle. So some organizations are pretty good at saying there are some rules that are so important that they need to be followed all the time. So whatever code you check in needs to follow those rules. But other rules maybe only apply to APIs that we, let's say, for example, expose to partners, right? We want those APIs to follow higher quality standards. So we have some additional rules that are a little bit harder to follow, but on the other hand, also lead to better APIs. And then you get to this point where you actually have different rule sets kind of tweaked by either the consumers or the lifecycle stage of the API or both, like this kind of thing. But like I said, in my mind, linting is a little limited. So I mentioned that earlier already. So we have the scoring model that we developed where we score APIs for their AI readiness. And we do have a good bunch of linting in there. So in our case, we use Spectral and Redocly because we think these are good tools. So we run that as part of our check. But we also have a good number of actually LLM-based checks in there because if you look at the AI readiness of APIs, what becomes more important is, for example, that the description of, let's say, an operation is not just there, but it's also written in a certain way, right? It's written in a way that really is helpful for an agent to follow. So you can then write rules, so to speak, but they are more like on the LLM level, where you say, these descriptions need to follow a certain style, right? They need to make sure what actually they need to represent intent. So what is the intent of somebody who would use this operation, right? So these are the kind of things that I think also become important. And these are the things that like the typical linting tools wouldn't be able to do, because they are much more on this kind of structural level. So yeah, I would say linting definitely is kind of, I would say by now it's a standard thing to do. It's very good as like your minimal line of defense. There is good software out there that you can just use. It's open source, at least in the case of Spectral and Vacuum. And yeah, definitely do that, but also look a little bit beyond that, right? It may be that you need a little bit more. That could be helpful as well.
Thank you. That is useful, and thank you for explaining that in the breadth. Erik, how do you set severity levels? Like, let's say I'm also posting it for you so you can see it. How do you set severity levels like error 1 info and an exception policy that avoids linter fatigue, but still raises the floor?
Well, that's kind of I would say a little bit of a tricky question, right? So I mean, severity levels really should be what you typically would expect, right? So if something really is like there's no discussion, right, this needs to be followed, then well, that's an error, right? That's a red flag. You have to fix that, right? There's no discussion. This is just a non-negotiable thing. And then you might have some warnings where it's really just the typical ladder of severity, right? Where you'd say for the warnings, you would still say, well, that's not great, but it's acceptable, but consider fixing it, right? It's still like you get a little bit of, it's not as good as it could be, but at least it's not really bad, because then it would be an error. And then for basically the informational ones, right, there might be things in there that you just find useful for people to know. I don't know how interesting those are. I think in most cases, what you probably would do, at least I've seen that done a couple times, is that those would not be really intended to be for developers to look at, but they would be more for downstream tooling. So they would contain information that then can be picked up by downstream tooling, where you say that's not an error, but it's an interesting observation that the linter made that is interesting to some tooling downstream, right? And then you can put in informational messages which allow basically the linter to, so to speak, communicate or to forward information to some downstream tooling.
Interesting. And speaking of like large specs, say tens of thousands of lines, so linting performance and PR feedback loops, become constraints. So what repository or spec structuring patterns reduce friction without fragmenting the contract?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
So on large specs, tens of thousands of lines, linting performance and PR feedback loops become constraints.
Yes.
What repository or spec structuring patterns reduce friction without fragmenting the contract?
Probably what you would want to do is just have certain workflows where you would not always lint the whole thing, right? So when you look at these large specifications that have tens of thousands of lines, I would say these are never in one file, right? They're always collected from a whole bunch of sources where you have schemas and this and that, right? So oftentimes you assemble them from various sources. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it makes much more sense to have the actual checks in place in these individual places, right? So instead of linting the whole specification the whole time, just look at doing that already when you make changes to the schema or basically little subsets of the overall specification. Because if you do that with a certain level of discipline, then you shouldn't have this compounding effect where then when you actually lint the big spec, right, you get hit with many errors because you're collecting so many things that haven't been linted before. So don't see linting as like the last step, right? Like do it as early as possible. So whenever you make any changes to things that go into an OpenAPI description at some point, right, which also our JSON schema files and so forth. Make sure that you already start your linting process there so that you don't just collect kind of the debt and then you're getting hit with it later on, and then you have to do just a lot of fixing that you probably should have done a little bit earlier.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Erik. I think it's time we take at least 1 or 2 questions. I see a lot of questions around MCP. I think we'll still have to wait for MCP 1 since we have the next section about agents and MCP. But we can probably take one question about 3.3. This one is from Miguel. It's about there is a proposal potential for 3.3. Miguel is asking for your thoughts.
Hey, Miguel. Good to see you here. So 3.3 is by now is just an idea, right? There are a couple of ideas around what 3.3 should focus on, and we're discussing that within the OpenAPI Initiative, where, by the way, Miguel is also hanging out. And personally, for me, because that's where I work right now, the big issue there actually should be to better understand how we could improve OpenAPI specifically with a focus on AI, because we haven't done that so far. And generally speaking, right, there are a whole bunch of discussions around how that could be done. It can be semantics. It also can be things like we have proposals around we maybe should make better clear how long an API actually is going to be around, until when you can safely use it, and all of these things. So because in the end, right, if we look at agents, and we probably get to that later on, the big difference is that agents always kind of use an API just at runtime, right? So they discover it and they decide, oh, this looks like a good API to use. I should probably start and use it. And then they need to find out what it does or what it doesn't do, or what it has in terms of side effects or constraints. And all these kind of things really probably could be surfaced in a little bit friendlier way through the API itself and not just in the documentation. So I think we will see more and more ways of how we can pull things a little bit from documentation where it's more intended for humans and put it into the description where it's also more helpful for machines, right? And there, another really interesting idea that I think would be cool to have is we have this other specification within the OpenAPI Initiative, which is called Arazzo. So Arazzo is a workflow language that allows you to basically orchestrate OpenAPI interactions. So you could say, in order to accomplish a certain goal, call this endpoint, then call that endpoint, then call that endpoint, right? So it's kind of just a simple orchestration language, so to speak. And right now, it's like a separate layer on top of OpenAPI. It also will be extended to cover async API as well. What would be cool, actually, would be to also, for the OpenAPI description, to maybe link to an Arazzo description, right? And say, hey, if you use this operation, it actually makes most sense when you use it as part of this workflow that you can find over there, right? Because that oftentimes is really hard for agents in particular to figure out those workflows and understand how to do 10 API calls in a row in a certain way. And Arazzo is really good at that, but we kind of need to make it discoverable. So that could be another way of what we can put in there, which I think also would fit very well into this bucket of thinking about AI-friendly features. But yeah, the discussion is open. And just as a reminder for everybody, the OpenAPI Initiative is an open source specification. So anybody can participate. You don't need to become a member. You don't need to pay any money or fees. Anybody is welcome. You can just join the discussion. Most of the discussions happen on Slack. So if you have any ideas or also questions around OpenAPI, it's a very active and welcoming community. Just check it out. It's openapis.org. And there you can find all the specifications and the ongoing work.
Good, thank you. I'll post that link also in the chat.
Yeah, please keep in mind it's openapis.org. The S is important.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
We do have some questions around AI agents and MCP. So let's just get to that section and talk a little bit more about that. And then I can just bring some questions on the stage as well. So with MCP ecosystem consolidating now under the Linux Foundation's Agentic AI Foundation. Erik, what's the minimum governance surface an enterprise needs before agents can use tools broadly?
So I'm still a little bit skeptical about MCP. Well, let's say of its long-term success. We'll see. I may very well be wrong. But in my mind, what I would really encourage everybody to do would be to first think about your API estate and to really think about your APIs and not to obsess too much over just MCP, because whatever you invest in better APIs becomes useful for everybody, right? Everybody can use that. If you invested in MCP, it's basically specifically for LLM consumers, which may sometimes make sense, right? So I'm sure there are cases where it does make sense. But in my mind, it's at least, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that long-term, probably the API landscape is kind of the foundational level that you will work with. And MCP, maybe it'll stick around, maybe it won't. We'll see. So, but for example, we at Jentic, right? I mean, we're supporting MCP because, well, you have to. But we're really not that invested in MCP itself. So if MCP went away and something else came along, for us, that actually would not be such a big deal. We could pretty easily replace what we have with whatever the new MCP is, and it would still work well, because in the end, what we do, we think of what we do as delivering capabilities to agents, and MCP is the current delivery mechanism, and you need one. But I wouldn't constrain too many things to just be in the MCP space. That would be my personal opinion around that.
Okay. I think it's time I brought one question on stage, and we can just keep our conversation going about MCPs and agents. All right. We have one question from Saf. Saf is asking, what makes an API truly agent-ready in production compared to normal REST API? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, just go to our API scoring tool and you'll find out. So oftentimes there are a variety of factors, right? So when you say, I mean, of course, right, there's a little bit of an assumption in that question when you say normal REST API, right? Like, what do you mean when you say normal? But oftentimes when you look at REST APIs in practice, they are relatively low level, right? So there are like a lot of operations in there that you can actually use, which makes it very flexible. But it also makes it a little harder to actually figure out how to combine these things, right? Which is why we have Arazzo and documentation and all these kind of things. As a interesting data point that I like to use is when you look at the GitHub API, the current GitHub API version 3 has around 1,100 operations. GitHub is a complex thing by now. You can do a lot of things on GitHub. And therefore, there are a lot of operations that are present in the GitHub API 700. But that also means actually for an agent to work directly with that GitHub API is pretty complex, because a lot of these operations need to be combined in a certain way to result in like the workflows that you really want to accomplish on GitHub. Right. And what's interesting, I think, in contrast, is to look at GitHub's MCP server. So GitHub's MCP server has around 70 tools, right? So way less. And those tools are kind of much higher level, right? So they really represent like entire workflows, entire things you may want to do on GitHub, and not like these more atomic operations that you would find in the API. So what I would argue is that actually if you had a agent friendly GitHub API, it might just also have these 70 operations, right? Now they are available through MCP because that's what GitHub wanted to support, understandably. But you could also argue that if you have an agent that wants to get stuff done through an API, then, well, it probably would be happier with those 70 higher level operations than with the 1100 operations that you would give it if you gave it the GitHub API as it is right now. And it's interesting to look at. So there are some agents, when you look at OpenClaw, for example, right? So OpenClaw really doesn't natively support MCP. It's not really part of the OpenClaw kind of out of the box experience. I mean, you can somehow get it in there, right? But OpenClaw actually natively works with APIs because also there are more APIs around than there are MCP servers around, even though they keep growing. But it's just the API space is just so much bigger because it has been around so much longer, right? It's not really a quality question. It's just a fact of life because APIs have been around for 15 years now, no, 25 years now. And I think in that case, right there is what I said a little bit earlier, there actually is a case to be made where it might make sense to say, I would actually first design those operations that make sense for agents. I would describe them in ways that are meaningful for agents. So create good descriptions, right? It's like, if you do this, this happens. If you want to accomplish this, do this. Don't use it for this. Basically, a little bit similar to how you would describe agent skills. And then you can either expose those operations through an API or through MCP or through both, right? But I think that should be the process basically going forward, to say, okay, how can I make an agent's life as easy as possible? And that probably will get you to the point where you have a little bit higher level APIs, not so much the very low level ones, and well described ones that are described in a way that makes sense for an LLM. And because they love that, also probably make sure you have lots of examples in there, ideally not just one example, but multiple examples. Also make sure you have meaningful error messages so that the agent can actually understand what happens. Even in the error message, you might make some suggestions around what to do now. Right. So you could be kind of much more helpful in terms of just talking to that agent and giving it information it can use to move on in some shape or form.
Thank you, Erik, for taking that question. I'll mark it as answered. Erik, meanwhile, before I bring another question on stage, I also want to ask, if you had to define what makes an API agent ready, what are the key things you'd look for? The properties, top properties you would score, and what are maybe the red flags?
Well, I mean, to some extent, that's what we just discussed, right? It's like you would look for it not being too fine-grained. You would look for it to be described at a level that is meaningful for an LLM, meaning that it has kind of human and intent-based descriptions. You would want it to have examples in there so that you can better understand what's going on. You would want it to have meaningful error messages so that it's easier to recover from problems that you may have encountered through operations. So yeah, I guess it's really kind of the same list that we discussed before, mostly, right? This idea of, at some level, you could say, taking the abstraction level of the API from that GitHub lower level API of 1100 operations to the GitHub MCP interface that just has 70 tools to it, which by the probably don't allow you to do everything you can do through the native API, but probably it's good enough. And if they get enough complaints that people want to do things that they cannot do through the MCP server, they just add a handful of tools. So that's fine.
Thank you. I just want to bring one more question on stage. This is from Miguel.
Hey.
All right. Miguel is asking, I think that it is essential for MCP, that is, tools to understand when they consume an API that has entered a deprecation plus sunsetting cycle. This is an important semantic signal for AI.
No, I agree. I like deprecation and sunsetting are dear to my heart. I wrote some small standards for that, how like an API can actually make that seen at runtime, right? And I think we will see and more of these runtime mechanisms being rolled out, because that's what agents really hopefully then will better understand, that they can say, oh, I'm using this API and it's working, but it's also telling me that it's only going to work for another 2 weeks. So maybe I should alert somebody that this API is going to go out of commission, or maybe I should look around for a replacement, right? So what exactly to do about it is a different issue. But yeah, I think generally speaking, as a consumer of an API, this is information that is relevant. And if we can make this information available at runtime, then users of the API can react at runtime, which I think is useful.
Interesting. Thank you. And I'll just bring in one more question with that from Saf on stage. In an agent-ready API, how do you design the question response schema so that an LLM can reliably choose the correct way, handle partial failures, and safely retry without duplicating side effects?
In an agent-ready API, how do you design a request response schema so that an LLM can reliably choose? I'm not quite sure I'm parsing this correctly. So in the end, it seems to be about schema design. Well, I mean, the schema design just becomes an aspect of the general design part of OpenAPI for AI consumption, meaning that you probably should have descriptions in there so that an LLM can figure out what certain things actually mean and can understand the schema. And in the end, it depends a little bit on, I mean, I'm getting a little bit confused here because this is kind of mixing different aspects. So if you have an API, that's one aspect. And then down there, it talks about tools, which maybe is referring to MCP, which would be a different layer, right? So just as an example, if you look at the GitHub duality that we just looked at with the GitHub MCP server and the GitHub API, right? The level or the way these are layered, right? You would say that you have the GitHub API, which has these 1100 operations. And then on top of it, you have the GitHub MCP server, which consumes the GitHub API and then provides certain tools to the LLM, right? So, but it exposes way fewer tools than it consumes API endpoints, right? So at that point, it probably also does aggregate schemas, simplify schemas, and leave out certain things. That is something where I find that really interesting. I'm curious to see how that will evolve. So I could imagine that we might also see standards supporting a more dynamic way of how a request can ask only for certain fields, right? And can say, I want to do this. I only want to have these things in my response. Only give me those. Because depending on what you're doing and how often you're doing that, that also may be pretty important in terms of saving your tokens, right? Not always sending around data that you don't really need, that kind of pollute your context and cost you tokens. And this right now is relatively static, right? So the standard model of APIs is that you have a request schema, you have a response schema, and these are relatively static. We'll see how that evolves. It's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, there's some other folks like the guys over at Wondergraph who are betting on GraphQL, right? Because GraphQL in that respect actually has a pretty nice built-in capability to just ask for the things that you want, and then you just get those things. That's actually kind of cool. REST doesn't have that somehow built into the language itself, right? It's like HTTP doesn't allow you to do that. But you could layer something on top of it where you could use the kind of accept mechanism of HTTP. We'll see how that goes. But that could be a interesting aspect of, I think, what this question is looking at in terms of how do you design things so that you just send the data back and forth that you actually need.
Awesome. I'll just mark it as answered. Erik, you also have an event with us coming up, which is about designing AI-ready APIs, which is on 23rd of May.
Yes.
Awesome. Tell us about that, because I see a lot of questions here about MCP AI agents, and I just shared your link in the chat as well. Please tell us.
Yes.
What the event?
Yeah, so we have an event that I will do together with my colleague Kil Commons, who's also at Jentic. He's head of enterprise architecture, and what we want to do is we want to explain a little bit that APIs probably will remain like a really important building block. They may even become more important because you have more and more of these agents around that want to consume information, that want to take action, and you need to provide ways for them to do that. And there are several ways how you could do that. So one is, and we talked about this already, is just making sure that your OpenAPI itself is actually AI friendly. So we will spend quite a bit of time with that. We also want to talk about the language that I mentioned already, which is Arazzo. So Arazzo is the workflow language, and that workflow language actually also allows you to pretty easily create basically new operations that you can then expose to agents. You can expose them through an API, you can expose them through MCP. It doesn't really matter that much, but you don't have to write code, right? It's the workflow is basically, there are design tools out there where it's kind of like block boxes and arrows, right? Or you can say, well, if that happens to this, to this, to this, to this. And so that could be an interesting way of basically creating capabilities that are easier to consume for agents and more helpful for agents. And then another thing that we also will discuss, so the OpenAPI and all of the workshop that we have, or the training, what is it called? Is it called a training or the workshop? I'm never quite sure.
Designing AI ready APIs.
Yeah, but is it a workshop or is it a training? How do you call these things?
It is a masterclass.
It's a masterclass. I like that word. Okay, so let's stick with that. So what we also want to do in the masterclass is we want to give you a good number of practical examples, and we want you to get your hands a little bit on tools, but we don't want to necessarily promote too many commercial tools. And therefore, what we want to do as well is to talk quite a bit about the OpenAPI specifications, because we think that open standards are important. Frank actually is one of the co-authors of the Arazzo specification. He also has been very active in the standardization space for a long time. So we want to talk about standards and how to use them. And there are these two standards we already discussed. There's OpenAPI and there's Arazzo. And there's a third standard that also has been published by the OpenAPI Initiative, which has been around for well over a year now, which is called overlays. Overlays is a way of how you can create, it's almost like a diff format, so to speak, for OpenAPI descriptions. So it allows you to easily tweak OpenAPI descriptions. And the way we use it, for example, is that if you give us an API to score, and we're telling you this API is not very well designed for AI, we also give you an overlay that has a couple of suggestions in there, right? So basically, it's easier for developer to look at the overlay, which is in a standardized format, and understand, okay, what would I need to actually change to improve my API description and or my API design? So if you look at the APIs going through a certain life cycle and also a certain refinement over time, maybe, then these overlays also are a pretty useful tool. And because of this, we also wanted to talk about those overlays a fair bit. And the idea of the whole masterclass really is to say that APIs will remain an important foundation of what you do in modern IT, regardless of whether those APIs are consumed by human developers or by agents. And a good way of handling them and building tooling around them is probably standards-based, because then you're not locking in yourself into certain products, right? It's more easy for you to combine products, to switch products, all the wonderful things of standards-based approaches. So that's our main goal there, is to, on the one hand, look at how API practices have changed a little bit in the age of AI, and also to tell the story of how standards can help you to actually do that.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. We also have a discount code. I've shared that in the chat. It's PACT50. So do sign up, and we'll just see you there. Thank you. And I think we have one more question before we move on from the topic of MCPs and agents. and talk a little bit about endpoints to workflows. We have one question from Miguel that we can bring on stage. All right, it's about OpenAPI 3.2 spec.
Well, that depends a little bit on how you're using it, right? So the question being, what parts of the OpenAPI 3.x spec would be essential for generating CP servers so that the intended business capabilities are well understood by the AI? Well, to a large extent, of course, more of the human readable parts, right, where you put descriptions of what that operation actually means. OpenAPI itself is very much like a very low level schema language, right? It tells you, well, here's an endpoint. This is what you can send to it. This is what you can get from it, but it doesn't really tell you what any of that means. And that meaning then is conferred often in descriptions, either at the operations or at the schema level. And therefore, these descriptions typically will be very important because hopefully they are rich and meaningful. And then they actually help an LLM to understand what things mean. Hopefully also, which also can help, is you're using names that are meaningful so that it's not just, there's not a parameter X and Y and Z, but they actually have names that maybe also carry a little bit of meaning. So that helps as well. And what also will help, and we'll have to see how practices adapting. So far, we're just at the beginning of that. But with the tags that we discussed, tags had been like a flat space so far, and with 3.2, now they're in a hierarchical space. So if people start using tags in a semantically rich way, then those also would become a very meaningful source of information so that the AI would get more understanding of what the API does or what the operations do or what parts of the payloads mean. But that all depends on those tags actually being rooted in some kind of semantic layer, right? And whether you do that or not is up to you. Like OpenAPI doesn't really tell you how to use those things. But I could imagine if people would try to start using tags in a richer way, that tooling would pick that up and help you. And then it's always kind of this co-evolution, right? So people may start doing certain things, then maybe some tooling will pick it up, and the tooling will also tell you, well, and if you also do this, then we can do an even better job, right? And then people start doing this as well, and then the tooling can evolve, right? So, I mean, that's kind of I would say, the fascinating but also slightly unpredictable nature of the standard space, that sometimes the features that you put into standards are just ignored for whatever reason. People just don't like them, don't use them, or tooling doesn't really support them. Other features sometimes kind of get very creatively repurposed for things that you didn't even have in mind, right? And then maybe you can pick that up in tooling and in later versions of the standard. So we'll see. I think we have had some interesting additions in 3.2, and we'll see how it goes. In the end, I think the true answer for this question will be in what do the tools out there do? Because that's, people always, if a tool does a cool thing and helps me getting something done better, then I'll happily do what the tool asks me to do, even if that is not exactly what the standard tells me to do, right? But I'll just adapt to the tools. I'll just hope that tool makers actually will be really creative and figure out cool stuff that then kind of finds its way into these practices.
Thank you for taking that question up, Erik. All right. Perfect. I think now we can just move on to our discussion. This part is going to be brief, and after that, we may take one or two more questions. So I just want to talk about Jentic. Jentic positions a workflow layer over the API ecosystem. So what workflow patterns show up repeatedly in enterprises, and what makes them stable under change?
The workflows. So, I mean, one example that actually we were not expecting, which is always good when you start talking to actual enterprises out there, right? So one example that we've now repeatedly found with companies we talk to is that they, in particular, companies that have relatively complex APIs that they expose to partners, right? So if you have a relatively complex API that you have to integrate with as a partner, That's complex, right? So sometimes it actually becomes relatively it's just a large engineering effort. If I want to interact with a certain company, I just need to understand all of their API. I need to understand how to use it. It has been built for potentially hundreds or thousands of partners, and I may only need like a small part of it. But I kind of need to understand all of it. And one of the things that we actually now actively pursue, because it's useful, is to use workflows to kind of create specific workflows for specific partners, right? And say, this partner only wants to do these things. So they get a bunch of workflows which work with the API, but they don't need to understand exactly how to use the API. They just need to understand the workflows that they can invoke. That makes it easier for them to integrate, because they only need to understand the workflows that have been created specifically for them, hopefully matching their use cases and scenarios and what part of the API landscape they want to use. And if, of course, the API landscape is managed well, these workflows also remain stable over time, unless you start breaking APIs. Right. So if you start breaking APIs, you also kind of break the workflows depending on the API. So you also need to fix those workflows. But as long as you develop your APIs in a backwards compatible way, you can change the APIs. And as a workflow user, you don't even need to know that the APIs underneath now do even more things. But like for years, like I don't care. I just keep doing what I've been doing and it's fine. So that's one of the scenarios that we've seen that actually we didn't even think about, but we've seen that actually quite a bit now, and has been surprising and interesting.
Interesting. You knocked off one of my questions over there.
Oh, good.
Now, Erik, this one is last one from me. So looking ahead, let's say 6 months from now, what should a senior engineer or a platform leader watch closely in standards or toolings or maybe governance for agent-facing APIs?
Yeah. So what I would recommend people to do, really, basically starting tomorrow morning, is start thinking about agents already. Right. It's like, even if you don't have them right now. And by the way, I mean, the term agent has become fairly meaningless to me. Like, everybody talks about agents and everything seems to be an agent now, pretty much. But anyway, what we see when we talk with organizations is that there are certain types of agents that actually already do get used a fair bit, like customer support agents, some kind of HR agents, right? So you could almost say these are agents that are useful across all industries. Probably everybody has some kind of customer support, everybody has some kind of HR thingy, somebody like whatever, right? Like, these are, so you can kind of buy these things, right? You just have to hook them up to your documentation and then they work and they're useful. So you do that. What you don't see quite as much out there is what I would say real business agents in production, where if you really talk about the kind of an agent, a business agent in the strong sense of the word, where you say, these are pieces of software that can sense things, that can take action, that take decisions, right? That have agency. I mean, in the end, right, it's that easy. They're called agents because they have agency. They're not just automation. They're more than that, right? And we don't see those things this much, actually, even though everybody talks about agents all the time. My point is that I do believe that we will see more and more of these, maybe not 100% where you hand over your entire business to agents, but you may trust them a little bit more, and then next year a little bit more, and then the year after a little bit more, right? So that's something that I think we will see. And because of that, I would say that you really should start thinking about the AI readiness of your APIs starting tomorrow, because API landscapes evolve slowly, right? Whatever you design today, whatever you change today, you will probably have around for a year or 2 or 3 before you touch it again, or before you want to touch it again. So I would highly recommend to make that part of your practices already. So we spoke a little bit about linting, right? So look at how you do linting. Look at how, are you optimizing just for developer experience, or are you also optimizing for agent experience? I mean, the good news in my mind is that if you optimize for agent experience, you kind of also get developer experience as one part of that, right? So it's not like you're totally doing a speculative thing. I think you are doing something that benefits you already, but it also is an investment into the future. So that would be my main recommendation, would be to really say, all of you platform people out there who are building API platforms or who are doing platform engineering, right? Like, think about how all of this will change if you have more and more agentic actors and consumers in your organization, and start planning for that today, even if you can maybe say that right now you don't have it this much and it's going to be another year or two, but it's going to arrive. I think that's at least my personal view.
Thank you. That's very edifying advice. I can see that we don't have any questions because you answered all of them quite thoroughly. Appreciate that. Now, since we've come to the end of this session, I just quickly want to point out that, yeah, I've shared the link for the event, your masterclass, in the chat, and also.
Yep, thanks.
Yeah. And also, please do subscribe to Deep Engineering. Erik, this really has been an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us, and also to everyone who joined us today. So what will happen from now on is we will make this video also available, as well as we will publish a Deep Engineering newsletter issue around our conversation. Yeah, please subscribe to Deep Engineering and look out for that session. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next Deep Engineering session. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for all the questions, Sakib. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our masterclass in about a month. That'll be cool.
Great. Awesome.